Welcome back. Let's dive right into Chapter 2. I've divided Chapter 2 into two separate parts to make it a little easier to digest. Chapter 2, Part A, is going to be noun phrases and verb phrases. Let's go ahead and get started. When we're talking about noun phrases and verb phrases, we're talking about members of the open classes. Come on in. We're open. When we say open classes, we're talking about four main types of words. We're talking about nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. These are the members of the open classes. We call them the open classes because they are allowed to admit new members to their ranks. This is kind of a fun exercise, actually, thinking of new words that have been added to the English language. Technology gives us a lot of these words. For example, the noun email. This is a word that was added to the English language not all that long ago. And that proves the point that nouns are members of the open classes. They can, in fact, admit new words. We're going to want to start thinking about new ways to define these words that we're pretty familiar with. Nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs. If I asked you for the definition of a noun, if you're anything like me, you're thinking in the back of your brain somewhere, person, place, or thing. Many of us were taught this in school, and it's a perfectly fine definition, but it's contingent on the meaning of the word. Similarly, if I defined verb as an action word, if I defined an adjective as a word that talks about a noun, if I defined adverb as as a word that talks about a verb, I'm talking about the meaning of these words. And that's fine. These definitions work well. It's all well and good, but you may not have known that you can also identify the words in the open classes by their endings. Whew, pretty exciting. This is because words in the open classes take different forms in their suffixes. What I mean is you can tell if something is a noun not just by what it means, but also by what forms it can take. More on this in a moment. Almost all of the words in our language are members of the open classes. These classes are constantly growing and expanding, so it makes sense that they would be huge, huge, huge. But because we can also talk about these classes in terms of their form, sometimes we call them the form classes. We'll talk much more about this in Chapter 12, coming up very soon. It only makes sense next to talk about the closed classes. These are the opposite of the open classes, of course, in that they do not accept new members. They are closed, closed, closed. And the kinds of closed class words we'll be working with today include determiners. These are words that mark nouns. We'll be talking quite a bit more about determiners in just a moment. Qualifiers. These are words that mark intensity. Prepositions. These are words that combine with noun phrases to produce adverbial or adjectival modifiers. We're going to learn all about these members of the closed classes, and some other members too, in Chapter 13, so stay tuned. Let's talk about the different forms nouns can take then, since they're members of the form classes. Nouns are kind of amazing because they take only two endings that prove their noun status, the plural and possessive. Plural S, possessive apostrophe S. These are suffixes, they come at the end of the word, and we call them inflectional suffixes. A lot more on this in Chapter 12, but for now, we call them inflectional. And if you can make it plural, and if you can make it possessive, then you can make it a noun. Let's practice with everybody's favorite noun, bulldog. What happens when we make this noun plural? Well, from bulldog to bulldogs, we add plural S ending, and we get a different version of the same noun. What happens when we make this noun possessive, like the toy of the bulldog? Well, of course, we get the bulldog's toy. We've taken this noun and we've made it possessive. I just proved, in other words, that nouns take two different inflectional suffixes to prove that they're nouns. If it's a word that you can make plural, if it's a word that you can make possessive, it's a noun. Let's talk about verb forms. Verb forms function similarly to noun forms. They have three different forms that identify them: the base form, the past tense, and the past participle. For example, the regular verb cackle has its base form, cackle, its past tense form, cackled, and its past participle, cackled. Side note, the reason we can tell that it's a regular verb is because its past participle, and past tense forms are the same. More on this when we talk about verbs, of course. Let's notice an irregular verb. It has its base form, go, its past tense form, went, and its past participle, gone. Hey, we know it's irregular because its past tense form and its past participle are different. Most verbs also have a few more forms: the infinitive, to cackle, to go, and the present participle, cackling, going. Believe me, we'll be talking more about verbs in chapters 4 and 5, so stay tuned. However, what we've done is we've managed to give ourselves a couple of new definitions for nouns and verbs. Instead of saying a noun is a person, place, or thing, instead of saying a verb is an action word, instead of defining them based on their content, we can now define them based on their form. A noun is any word that can be made plural and or possessive, the way we did with bulldog or bulldogs. And a verb is a word that can show tense, such as present and past. Now that we've talked about nouns and verbs in form, it's time to talk about how they combine with other things. Let's dive into noun phrases, or NPs, as we will so frequently call them. Phrase is a single word or a group of words that functions as a unit within a sentence. This is a little bit different than the way we normally define phrase. We tend to think of phrase as just sort of a loose collection of words. A phrase can be just one word, certainly, and it has a very strict definition within our syntax. When we say noun phrase, when we say verb phrase, we're talking about very specific things. In the example, Butch snored. This is a complete sentence. It's a very short sentence, but it contains two separate phrases. It has a noun phrase, or NP, in Butch, and it has a verb phrase, or VP, in snored. Every time we have a phrase, we have a head word. In the noun phrase, the head word is a noun. In the verb phrase, the head word is the verb. When we start doing sentence diagrams, the head word goes on the main line. I put this in bold in hopes that you will remember it when we get there. Lots of noun phrases have determiners. They don't have to have determiners, but they certainly can. For example, the noun phrase Butch doesn't have a determiner. It's a proper noun, so it usually wouldn't. But lots of noun phrases will, in fact, have determiners. So we'll see determiners like articles, possessive nouns, possessive determiners, demonstrative determiners. Let's talk about determiners then just a little bit more. Yay, determiners! Here's a sentence: the bulldog pranced. We're going to use it to exemplify how determiners work. One kind of determiner is the article, definite or indefinite. The bulldog pranced, a bulldog pranced. What numbers can also be determiners? 2 bulldogs pranced, 1,000 bulldogs pranced. Possessive nouns can function as determiners. Nicole's bulldog pranced. Zach's bulldog pranced. Nicole's is a possessive noun. It's also functioning as a determiner. We also have possessive determiners. My bulldog pranced, her bulldog pranced, our bulldog pranced. Demonstrative determiners telling you which one, that bulldog, those bulldogs. If you have a proper noun, as we talked about earlier, you don't need a determiner. Cassidy pranced, Meatball pranced. I just think that's a great bulldog name. And even though determiners frequently signal the head word, they don't have to be right next to the head word. You can, in fact, insert an adjective in between a determiner and a head word, as in the example, the fancy bulldog pranced. So to recap, not all noun phrases have determiners, but a lot do. And more importantly, if you see a determiner, you know for sure that a noun phrase is coming up. You're dealing with a noun phrase. This is big. This will help us quite a bit when it comes time to diagram. So we've actually added a little bit on then to our definition of a noun. We have 3 characteristics for it. It can be made plural or possessive. It's the head word in the noun phrase, and it's often signaled by a determiner. Let's learn a little bit more about verb phrases now, aka VPs. They have many components too. They can be as small as just the verb all by itself. In Butch snored, the intransitive verb snore is the entire VP. And it's the head word, of course. If we're dealing with a transitive verb, which is to say a verb that takes an object, we could have a direct object included in the verb phrase, such as Janelle took the pencil, took the pencil is all the verb phrase. We could have indirect objects. Rachel gave Janelle the pencil. Janelle and the pencil are both objects of the verb and part of the verb phrase. Most verb phrases also include adverbials. When I say adverbial, I mean anything that functions adverbially. An actual adverb would certainly count, or a prepositional phrase. We'll hear a bit more about prep phrases in part B of chapter 2. Example, Janet asked a question politely. Here the adverb is part of the verb phrase. Or AJ took his position on the mat. Here the prepositional phrase is part of the verb phrase. So the entire verb phrase, whether it's just the verb head word, whether it's the head word with direct object or indirect object, whether it's the head word with adverbials, or whether it's a combination of those last two, this whole thing, this whole shebang, is called the predicate. This gives us then something kind of exciting. We have an actual sentence formula. Yes, our grammar class is taking English and turning it into math. But it's a very simple formula, so I don't think you'll mind. To be a complete sentence in English, you have to have a subject, it's going to be our noun phrase, and a predicate, the verb phrase. If you have a subject and a predicate, if you have a noun phrase and a verb phrase, then you have a sentence. In your homework, I'll be asking you to come up with some very short sentences to practice this new formula we've learned. That's it for now. Cassidy would like to encourage you to get up, take a little break, stretch your legs, and then come on back for part B of chapter 2.